live. We're live. What's up, everyone who's watching? This is gonna be an interview with Stephan Kinsella. Should be epic. He's gonna be here in a couple minutes, and it should be great.
All right, and I've got my OBS recording as well, so we have like a physical copy.
I'll record the Zoom.
It says my internet connection is unstable. What's this about?
We started live a bit early, because Kinsella's going to be here in a couple minutes. That'll be fun.
Okay.
Yo, Glyph, put this in the Discord, the announcement.
What?
Like show this on the Voluntaryist Haven Discord.
Yeah, hold on. I can't even add everyone, bro.
You can't?
No.
Bro, what?
Well, that's interesting. Hold on.
Great. The internet guy coming to fix my internet was supposed to be here an hour ago. Mm-hmm. He's running an hour late, so my internet might cut out in the middle of this.
All right, we'll take over then and talk about it.
Yeah. So I mean, I want to get my thing out of the way first.
Copy too.
I want you to get my thing out of the way first, and then you can go through the itinerary.
We'll start with like thoughts on like objective law and like the minarchist and objectivist views in the state.
Make sure he's not in the waiting room.
Yeah, I know. I have my participants up, so if I see him, he comes in right away. Where's everyone else in the Voluntaryist Haven at?
Good question.
I don't know. Send the thing again. Tell everybody to join.
Oh, he's here.
All right.
Okay. Hello. Welcome in. I would like to welcome everybody. We would like to introduce Mr. Is it Stephan Kinsella or Stephan?
Stephan, can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Yep.
Yes, sir. We would like to introduce Mr. Stephan Kinsella and thank him for coming here today. Mr. Kinsella is an Austro-libertarian legal theorist. He is founder and executive editor of the Libertarian Papers, founder and director of the Center for the Study of Innovative Freedom, a member of the editor board of Reason Papers, and much more. Mr. Kinsella, again, thank you for coming. If you'd like to give an intro, you can.
No, I'm fine. I'm a patent attorney and a libertarian writer here in Houston, Texas, and just enjoying this crisp winter day, and happy to talk to you guys about whatever you want to chat about.
Awesome. So we will have hopefully some more guys joining in here, but I know when we emailed, we had talked about the limited government guys and the objective law, but I've actually, I've come up with something today in preparing for this interview that I really wanted to run by you and make sure we had time for, if that was all right. It's in regards to argumentation ethics.
Sure, anything.
Okay. So are you familiar with ethical intuitionism?
Yeah, a little bit.
Okay, so for example, Michael Huemer has expanded upon it in his book, Ethical Intuitionism, and it's a meta-ethical standpoint that evaluative property or evaluative statements are not necessarily or reducible to non-evaluative statements. And this gets around the is-ought problem, because you can just say, you have an intuition, say, murder is bad. And you're justified in believing this intuition so long as you are not provided with any further justification that this appearance, this intuition is wrong. I could go more into that, but that's just like the basis of it. So I understand that argumentation ethics, as it stands right now, as far as I know, with you and Hapa have agreed that it cannot bridge the Izot gap. That it is, you can say that to argue against these things would be a performative contradiction, but it's still not within the realm of a normative like ought statement, right?
Right.
Okay.
And I'm familiar generally with Humer's view. I haven't read his book. I don't tend to. I agree with his conclusions mostly, which are mostly anarchist, pragmatic anarchist. Except he's strangely, if I recall, he's not very good on, or he's not decisive about intellectual, which is strange to me for
Right.
a principled, thoughtful anarchist thinker to libertarian to not be good on IP. And I think my friend David Gordon is also an intuitionist. I don't know if he talks about it much, but he's told me that.
Okay.
So yeah, if you want to know, go ahead.
So this was just my bringing argumentation ethics into the normative realm through ethical intuition. So I can say, for example, I have an ethical intuition that peaceful resolution is good. This is a normative statement. This need not be reduced to any descriptive statements about the world because I have this intuition a priori. I am justified in believing this position so long as I am not provided with any justification otherwise. This would bring argumentation ethics into the normative world, as I am justified in believing my intuitions unless I am presented with a reason to doubt my intuition. However, the only way to come to a truth claim is through argumentation. Therefore, to reject my intuition that peaceful conflict resolution is good, you would have to use peaceful conflict resolution. Thus, you are implicitly using an intuition that this is the proper way of reaching a truth claim, thus contradicting yourself. Thus far, argumentation ethics has been non-normative, as you and both Hapa, you can't get across the Izot. However, intuitionism doesn't have this problem, as it is a dualist position holding that we can make evaluative claims that are not reducible to natural properties or non-evaluative claims. So I believe that if I have this intuition that, for example, initiation of force is wrong normatively, that in order for me to come to a further conclusion that this intuition was wrong, you would have to be engaging in argumentation, which would be unable to provide me with justification that my intuition is wrong. And this is completely normative. This is initiation of force is wrong. We ought not to initiate force.
Well, I think that's right. The way I look at it, I don't know if the concept of intuition is rigorously defined. I think an intuition is just another word for your preferences. I think there's many ways to get to the sort of psychological and other reasons that we are libertarians or that we prefer these things. I think you could explain it empirically in psychological or in sociological or in evolutionary terms. Like we're a social species, and for various reasons we tend to develop empathy, which is that we value our lives by virtue of being evolved to be a type of life form which seeks to procreate, preserve its own life. So we're naturally self-interested, but we humans are social and we value other people as well. So I think you can explain that as empathy. Why we have that is interesting, but it's not really relevant. It's just the fact that we do. Not everyone does. There are certain, I would call them defective humans or outliers or outlaws that are psychopaths or sociopaths or politicians who don't have much or any value on others' well-being, and they're willing to use them as means, right? So I guess the question is, how do you justify? I wouldn't say that you're justified in believing in intuition as a first approximation or anything. I don't think it's a justification. I think it's a starting point for the values that you hold. If you prefer peace and prosperity of humanity as a whole, that means you have some empathy towards their circumstances. Why you hold that, I don't know. I guess you can call that an intuition. But this is what you can point to when you're trying to establish a higher level set of norms. You can point to lower level norms, which I sometimes call grund norms or ground norms, following the terminology of Hans Kelsen, a legal theorist. And what argumentation ethics does is it tries to show that these lower level values are undeniably accepted by everyone who participates in discourse itself. So I guess what you could say to reformulate the humor type view or the intuitionism view is that when anyone engages in peaceful discourse, trying to decide which higher level interpersonal political norms we should adopt, that is, which laws we favor and which we think are just or fair, we all come into that arena because of a reason, because we, for some reason, prefer peace, prefer to find a solution that allows peace to reign, allows us to be cooperative. And you could call that your intuitions, which drives you to that level of discourse in the first place. So I don't think that, and I don't even think consequentialism is incompatible with this argumentation ethics view either. I think they all merge together, and I would look at ethical intuitionism as just something like that. But again, I haven't read this book.
One thing that stuck out to me is you said that these your intuitions would be somewhat of like a preference. This is like that would be like a non-cognitivist like point of view, whereas like intuitionism falls under the realm of it is cognitive, or a cognitivist meta-ethical position. And humor goes into why these things can't just be our preferences about things, and why these. Because I'm just like reading through the book, I guess I wouldn't be able to. They say you don't know something well enough unless you can explain it in simple terms. I don't know if I could best explain it in simple terms right now. Like I said, I really came to this realization within the last like 3 hours. So like this idea that it's like people's preferences would be like a non-cognitive point of view. Which I don't hold that. I think like linguistically we can look at things, and just typically the non-cognitivist position is pretty untenable as far as when we make statements such as this is bad. It can't be just if you were saying, well, I think that this is bad, you were either abandoning non-cognitivism for subjectivism, or these things cannot be true. But the reason
I guess, well, hold on a sec. Wait, pause for a second. Let me ask you this, because I think there's something possibly to this. I'm not sure rigorously what it means to say this is bad, because sometimes the connotation is you're saying it's some kind of objective fact about the world, right? That's why I think it's more rigorous and more precise to say it is true. It is accurate to talk about what people prefer, because that can be demonstrated, right, or can be explained in a clear way, because we demonstrate what we prefer by our actions, right? We demonstrate a preference. So it is true that we have values and we have preferences. That is true,
right?
And I don't know if that's the same as saying I label or describe this as bad. To me, that's just another way of saying I don't like that, or I don't prefer that.
Yeah. So let's see. Hold on one sec. Okay. Yeah. Again, so like I would have to. It seems like you're taking like the non-cognitivist position, which is fine. And like I said, I'm not well read enough on meta ethics to provide you right this moment why that is wrong, or why I believe that is wrong. But
I'm not really taking a position. I'm just trying to explain. I guess I'm not clear what your question is.
So yeah, I was just trying to formulate argumentation ethics in a way beyond just. I was trying to formulate it in a way that overcomes the Izzat problem, for example. So like in saying that we have these things, say we have an intuition that enjoyment is better than suffering, or if A is better than B and B is better than C and A is better than C, or it is unjust to punish a person for a crime he did not commit. These are just examples he gives in the book, right? And he says that we are justified in believing these intuitions just as much because he employs what he calls phenomenal conservatism, which is just the basic premise that we are justified in believing appearances. This does not mean that the appearances necessarily are reality. So for example, if I see an optical illusion, I am justified in believing in this illusion until I am presented with a further appearance appearances can only be overwritten by future or further appearances, that this was in fact an optical illusion and that was not really reality. This does not mean that this appearance doesn't no longer exist. It's just that you no longer believe in this appearance. So he holds intuitions that if you don't believe in being justified in belief and intuitions, then there is no reason to be justified in your belief of your experience and justified in the belief of your introspection. So if you don't employ his phenomenal conservatism, he says that you are committed to a global skepticism. So he just gets to this, that there are some things that we know intuitively. And my whole point in this was to try and bring argumentation into the normative realm.
Well, but let's talk about what you just said. And again, I'm going by what your description and what I kind of sense about some of his or this theory. My suspicion is, well, first of all, I'm heavily influenced in my epistemology by Ayn Rand and David Kelly and their theory of concepts and knowledge and their views on skepticism and things like that. And also by Mises and his dualism, and also by the kind of related type of in terms. I suspect that humor is really not steeped in all this, and that he's doing sort of a reinventing the wheel kind of amateur's approach to all this. And I don't think I agree with what you just said. For example, I is correct in that we are justified, if you want to call it that. I tend to use the word justify for justifying normative views, but I think we're justified in believing the evidence of the senses for various reasons, which David Kelly adumbrates in his book, The Evidence of the Senses, and also in a great lecture series. I think it's called The Foundations of Knowledge. It's available on YouTube. It's from the 1980s. But I don't think that translates to normative views at all. I think what happens is that we tend to be a social species, and we tend to be empathetic and value others. And we have had hundreds of years, thousands of years of human society and tradition and thinking, and we figured some things out by now. So these intuitions are just sort of the layman's or the average. It's sort of like most people now have a dim sense that communism or socialism or central planning can't work because they saw the Soviet Union fall in the 90s. They don't have a deep theoretical understanding like Mises did, but they have a dim understanding of the unworkability of socialism and the relative superiority of the free market. Okay, so I think by the same token, most of us in our private lives have these basic civilized values like peace and prosperity, and we sense that it's wrong to punish an innocent person for a crime because we've had experience with this over the ages. You can call that an intuition if you want, but I think you're justified in going by custom and the received wisdom that has undergirded society because it has worked to let us be civilized to a certain degree. But I don't think that rejecting the idea that you're justified in holding your basic normative intuitions to be presumptively just because they're intuitive. I don't think rejecting that idea entails a skepticism, because you can still be a non-skeptic in the field of of sense data and perception and cognitive understanding of the world, right? So we sense the world, and so like the illusion example you gave, I don't think that it is possible to have a false perception, right? It's not possible. So when you perceive a stick bent in the water, we call it an illusion, but we only call it an illusion because the form in which we perceive it is unusual. It's not the normal way we perceive a stick. If you look at a stick, normally it seems straight. But if it's half bent, if it has half dipped in water, it's refracted because of the laws of physics and optics, and it appears to be bent, but it's not. But you're still perceiving the stick, and you're perceiving it as bent because that's the only way you could perceive it, because of the nature of reality and the physical nature of our senses. So I don't think you are. It's not possible to perceive the stick in any other way, and you are perceiving the stick. And it's not just an appearance, it's the form in which you perceive the stick, given the nature of our senses. So I don't think that lends any support, though, to the fact that we have intuitions about what's right and wrong, and those could be presumed to be true. I think that the objectivity and the lack of skepticism and even relativism of the validity of our senses and our conceptual faculty doesn't translate over to the normative realm. That would be my first take on it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I do believe he addresses it. While you were talking, I was trying to flip through and find exactly where he talks about this specifically, because I do remember him talking about somebody who would have the objection that, well, we could have intuitions about descriptive things, like I can intuitively think that one line is longer than another, but in reality, it's not.
And hold on a second. So the way the objectivist would say that is that your percepts cannot be in error, but your concepts can. Concepts, well, they're higher level concepts that our conscious brain integrates, and a mistake can. So I see a stick in the water, assume that of mistaken. So it's likewise, if you see two lines and they're drawn in such a way as to confuse you at the conceptual level, that's just a conceptual error. Now, intuitions, of course, can underlie also scientific inquiry or mathematical inquiry, whatever. Like you're trying to solve a problem, you're trying to understand a law of nature, you're trying to formulate a causal relationship and explore it with empirical methods, and also with intuition. Yeah, you could have an intuition that hey, gravity makes things fall at the same rate instead of different rates. Like your first intuition might be that a heavier object would fall faster than a lighter object, but you do the test and that hypothesis is not confirmed; it's falsified. So then
I actually like that you. Oh, I'm sorry.
You have to go ahead.
Oh, I like that you bring up that specifically, because that's actually an example that he gives specifically in the book. Is that again, it's not that we are justified in just so. For example, if I have an intuition that murder is not wrong, if I am provided with further justification that murder, well, is in fact wrong, well, then I would no longer be justified in believing that murder is wrong. So, and he talks about the example specifically, this might have been in one, I don't know if it's in this book specifically, it might have been in one of his papers that I just read, but about like a ball dropping and testing it, and it might seem, you might have this intuition that this should drop faster, but in reality it doesn't. Well, then you are no longer justified in believing the initial appearance that your intuition, led you to believe these things. I'm not able to find here specifically
but hold on a second.
Go ahead.
Well, let's go back to that for a second. In that case, I would say that. So in this case, I would go more with the Hoppian, Hans Hermann Hoppe's sort of neo-Kantian, but a realistic neo-Kantian, not an idealistic Kantianism. But this idea that all of the natural sciences and causal inquiries really rest upon an a priori base, right? You can call them intuitions, but they rest upon certain assumptions. Like, for example, if you're trying to formulate a causal law and you're trying to do experiments like the scientific method, right? Following the scientific method, trying to do an experiment to falsify or to confirm your hypothesis or your theory about what causal laws are there, you're presupposing that the universe is governed by causes in the first place, by cause and effect. And that is not testable in itself, right? The scientific method is not testable. It's outside of that. So it all rests upon a priori theories. Now, I would say that from what you described, what he's talking about if you have an intuition or a belief that murder is not justified, and then you have some other belief that contradicts it, the reason you're not justified in holding that other belief is because you a priori know that contradict. It's just a filtering mechanism. You're eliminating two statements as being both true because they contradict each other, and you got to choose one. But I'm not sure why he knows which one you choose from intuitionism. Your first intuition or your second proposal?
Right. I see what you mean. I'm sure. Let's see. This is not to deny the intuition as a role must come to conclusion.
Does he?
Yeah,
Let
I
me
don't
ask you a
wanna- I don't
question.
wanna take
Does
up-
he
yeah,
rely
go ahead.
any? Does he rely at all in his book on Jan Lester, J.C. Lester's theories? I can't remember if he does.
Not that I'm aware of. I haven't seen that name mentioned here.
Yeah. Jan Lester is another anarchist, but he's more. I forgot what word he uses to describe his view. He rejects justificationism per se. He thinks you should. Oh God, if you look, his book is Anarchy and Leviathan or something like that. And again, he's bad on IP too. Whenever an anarchist, libertarian anarchist, is bad on IP, I automatically suspect something's wrong with their theory, because if it doesn't lead them to the correct view on that issue, then there's something flawed in their whole foundation. But he talks about impositionism rather than aggression, and he thinks that you have to propose something and it can be tested by reasoning, something like that. But he's totally opposed to the idea of justificationism. So he rejects consequentialism and the more deontological type reasoning. And I can't remember if Humer borrows from that or not, from Lester's views.
From what you just explained to me, I would say that he doesn't. In this book, actually, specifically, he doesn't bring up like this book is not at all about libertarianism or any of that. This is just my own from going through the book so far and reading about this ethical intuitionism, then trying to apply it to argumentation ethics. Most of the things you brought up, I believe, are addressed here. However, I'm of course having issue finding them on the spot. You know, it's a pretty big book, and I've got a lot of stuff marked here. However, I don't want to take too much time on this. I would like to get to the other stuff. I appreciate
Sure.
Talking about this. So yeah, I guess we can move on to. I find interesting what this Randian concept, or these people that have been calling themselves radical capitalists. They reject the term minarchist because they don't like but they're also people like essentially Randians, but they don't believe in the objectivist philosophy. And so they have this concept.
Wait. Who are you referring to?
This is just like another group of people on social media going around currently. Like we are the group Voluntaryist Haven. There's another group of young individuals going around with these new ideas, right? And just like limited government people in general. But they have like this concept of objective law, and
they reject the term anarchy, though.
Right, because they don't like they reject self-ownership. They don't like Nozick's view on the locking. They essentially take Rand's standpoint on rights. They take Rand's standpoint on limited government. They take Rand's standpoint on just about everything except objectivism, and they come to this limited government conclusion. So you have this term.
In other words, they're like the Libertarian Party. In other words, they're just libertarians who are not anarchists. Is that what you mean?
Correct. I would.
Yeah.
I guess so.
So they reject libertarianism because they believe that it lacks philosophical backing. It's kind of their justification for.
Well, that's what Ayn Rand always said, right? That's what the Randians always say.
Yeah, it's a Randian concept, yeah.
Right. So my point here is that Ayn Rand defines objective law as essentially, but the direct consequences of your action. So I know if I steal from somebody, there will be this specific punishment for this action. And I don't think that excludes, contract law under an anarchist society. You come onto my property, we are contractually agreed that you won't break these obligations. If you do break these obligations, you are to compensate me in this way. I would consider that to be objective. Beforehand what the consequences of your actions will be when you come onto my property. I think their concept of objective law actually fits within the realm of an anarchist society.
Well, so I used to be a member of the TAFL, the Association for Objective Law, when I was an objectivist. So by objective law, I think they mean a couple of things. In one sense, the predictability of law is one feature of it, but even Hayek talked about that. But you can be a statist and be in favor of objective law in that sense, like Hayek was. Hayek believed in all sorts of statist laws, as long as they're general and they're predictable. So you can adjust your affairs according to it, which is, if you live in North Korea, you live in objective law because you know what not to do to avoid going to prison. But in the other sense of objective law, I think they mean that laws that can be objectively justified. And in that loose sense, I think we agree with that. The problem is they believe that you have to have a central state and ultimately a one world government to have objective law. And they also believe in legislation. They're perfectly fine with not just with decentralized common law means of generating and developing the law, but they're also fine with legislation. In fact, I had a debate one time with Murray Frank, who was Ayn Rand's lawyer, because they're in favor of intellectual property, and I observed it was in a little debate in the pages of an objectivist newsletter, and David Kelly had written, I think it was David Kelly's group, and David Kelly had written something pro-IP, and I wrote something about how it's unjust for the following reasons, and because it relies upon creationism, which we can get into, or I've gotten into before, but also because it depends upon legislation, because patent and copyright never arose on the common law and could not conceivably arise on the common law as a private law that develops organically and naturally. In other words, it's not a natural right, it's an intervention into the natural legal order and the free market system by a committee of bureaucrats who issue their decrees, which is what a legislature is. And Kelly said, nothing wrong with legislation to come in and correct the common law when it's a non-objective law. So they're totally in favor of legislation, which to my mind is the analog to central planning of the economy. There is no reason to expect any legislation to ever be just, and in fact, it's usually not just.
Right, that's actually one of my biggest contentions.
Except as insofar as it's a costly common law system. Yeah, that's it.
Oh, sorry, you were cutting out, so I thought you had stopped. I apologize. Yeah, I was going to say that's one of my biggest contentions with besides like obvious ones with like a limited government and such, but is the existence of intellectual property. But also, so we've discussed this with them before, and they obviously they don't consider that their government maintains the initiation of force, which I find interesting, because if the government doesn't maintain the initiation of force, then it presumably cannot stop alternative agencies from arising to enforce the laws. Essentially, they must maintain the initiation of force, thus violating property rights that they so claim to be protecting.
Yeah.
Or it's not a state. So we've kind of come to
let me go into that, because that's interesting. They're only I've objected to that, and others have objected to that, and their only response is that it's necessary. I mean, David Kelly has a great article in the Freeman from the 70s. I think it's called The Necessity of Government. It's about as good of a case as you could make for the objectivist view of the government. But because just saying necessarily commits aggression, then now they're condoning aggression, and just all they're really saying is sometimes aggression is necessary. But that's what statists believe, and that's what criminals believe. So I think of it this way: if the state has a definition, and we can agree on some definitions, but the state has to do one of two things to be a state. It has to either tax, or it has to outlaw competitors. And it always does both, but either one implies the other, because even if you didn't outlaw competitors, if you could tax the population, you could still drive the competitors out of business because you have a competitive advantage, just like the public schools or dominate the private schools in the US because most people can't afford to pay twice. Or if you can outlaw competitors but you don't tax, you can still effectively tax because you can charge a monopoly price for the service, which is like a tax. So basically a monopoly on law and order and defense and justice is equivalent to a tax, and vice versa.
I see.
And they believe in one or the other. By the way, David Kelly and Jan Helfeld, I talked to David Kelly at PorcFest about 7-8 years ago, and you know how the objectivists say that they're for voluntary tax, not for actual taxation, but David Kelly and Jan Helfeld admitted that they think Ayn Rand was wrong on that, and basically you have to have taxes, and taxes are justified. So in the end, objectivists do believe in taxation, which of course is theft.
So yeah, in the something you brought up to me just now, or that I had not thought about at all, is because the way they conceive of is like at least the people we've been talking to as well. If somebody breaks into your home, you know, you call the police and then you pay them. That's how you pay for the services. I didn't even think about the fact that, well, if they are the sole competitor, or that they will essentially charge whatever they want. They can charge the monopoly price, and that it could be conceived of as taxation. Because say like the market equilibrium rate for the service would have been like $15, and they can charge you $20, and because they can prevent any competition from coming into existence, you could almost think of this somewhat as a unjust taxation of, you know, the difference, $5.
Well, not only that, they can't help but charge a monopoly price because there is no market price anymore, because they've eliminated competition, they've eliminated the market, they've eliminated the price system. So they have to charge a price that's arbitrary. And of course, they're just going to charge whatever is comfortable to charge, which will invariably be the wrong price. There's no reason to think it would be lower than the free market price would have been. It will always be inefficient because they're not facing competition. So it will always be higher. It will necessarily be a monopoly price.
Right. So I guess the next segue would be into the realm of rights recognition and sovereignty. I think that the general idea here, for me at least, is that, and I read the articles you sent me about the one world government, and I actually had, before you sent me these, I had kind of the same idea. States exist in a relation of anarchy between each other. There is no higher power governing their sovereignty between each other. They can exist and coexist within a world without a higher power. So there's no reason that I need a higher entity above me and my neighbor Joe Bob and his neighbor to recognize each other's rights as well. I would like to hear your thoughts on that. Hopefully.
Well, the objectivist, right, that there's no such thing as international law, because anarchy doesn't work, apparently. But there is international law. I have a degree in it. It's practiced widely in the world and it's widely respected. So objective law is possible between actors without a sovereign over them.
I see. I think even if we get to this conclusion, though, I think we could still come back to the this whole, you know, sure, you know, states of conglomerations of millions and millions of people can recognize sovereignty in between other states, but this idea that, you know, each individual, you know, person has his individual rights recognized without this above entity it seems a bit ludicrous to them.
Yeah, I think it's just a pragmatic thing for them. So they think that they must apparently think that you can have order between anarchistic actors if there's only a few, but if it's too many, it's unworkable. Now, what that number is, I'd like to see the objectivists say. Like, would they be in favor of a world of 10,000 Liechtensteins? Because I would. This is what Hoppe argues. And another guy you might want to read if you haven't is Anthony DeJasse. His book, I think it's all really good, and he talks about the contradictions in this idea of having a constitution or having one government that can stick to a constitution because there's no higher power above it to make it respect the social contract, so-called, between that state and the people. Hoppe talks about this a lot, about how by the nature of a monopolistic institution, it's necessarily going to provide inferior service and at higher prices. And, you know, inferior service in the terms of justice means it will violate rights. It will do injustice. And of course, they always have. There has never been a minarchist state in the world. You know, these minarchists, even if they don't like the term, night watchman state, minarchists, classical liberals, whatever you want to call them, they ridicule anarchists for proposing what they think is an unworkable system. But there's never been minarchy either. So why do they think that it's possible to have minarchy? every state always grows. Even a core minarchist state would metastasize into what we have now. In fact, it did. They glorify the original United States of America as some quasi-minarchist, near objective libertarian society, which of course it was not. Blacks were enslaved, poor people were conscripted, women didn't have rights, Indians were murdered. It wasn't an objective society, but there was taxation, there was conscription, but even if you grant that the original United States was some almost perfect society, which is implied in Atlas Shrugged, by the way. If you recall, at the end of Atlas Shrugged, she had her legal avatar, Judge Narragansett, crossing out a few words in the Constitution, making it perfect, implying that it was almost perfect, but he was going to get it just right. But that near perfect society has turned into what we have now, which is a colossal state, which is the most menacing, powerful state in world history. So the best state in the world has turned into the worst.
Right.
So,
yeah, I do find this concept interesting, that you give an entity a monopoly on not only enforcing the law, but they also create and interpret the law. They have the monopoly on the interpretation of it, so they interpret it in whatever way they see please. I also think, I know there's been papers on it, I haven't really read into it, but I also the idea of like judicial review is kind of definitely an easy way for, I think judicial review is how usually these governments end up expanding a lot of times, is that if say a Supreme Court says something is unconstitutional, that carries a lot of weight. But if a Supreme Court says something is constitutional, that carries even more weight. And that's kind of how we've ended up where we are now.
Well, the Constitution itself, everyone thinks of it as the protector of our rights, but just think of the word Constitution means to make up. The whole purpose of the Constitution was to create a new government, which it did. It wasn't to protect our rights, it was to create a new government. But they were afraid that this new government would violate our rights, so they put in limits on it. They try to put in limits, but the limits are interpreted by that same agency. So they predictably interpret for over the years. Hello?
Yeah, sorry. I was I think I'm having some internet issues. If somebody wants to take over with the questions, you can look at my itinerary. I think we can move on to the second order topics.
I don't see anyone else's video. Is that on purpose?
Everybody but Austro Hayek is on for me.
Oh, I see. I was in that gallery view. Now
Okay.
I'm there. Okay, I see you guys now.
Okay, actually, I think my internet's back in. I guess the next thing I wanted to move on. I think we've addressed a lot of the main contentions the limited government guys have with market anarchy. System without government.
Saying your internet was bugging again.
Okay. Can you guys hear me?
No.
Yeah, we can now.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So I guess we've covered most of the main contentions that the minimal governments guys usually have. I guess moving on to the next one would typically be the concept of children under an anarchist system, children's rights, protection of children, things such as this without a government. I get like just I guess it's kind of broad, but just the general concept of making sure child abuse doesn't happen, or is prosecuted, I guess you could say, if it does happen, if it does occur.
Well, when we come up with these difficult issues or issues that really concern us, I always like to think, what's the alternative? In other words, you could paint these scenarios like, how does your libertarian theory handle like two guys in a lifeboat on the ocean, and there's only enough food for one of them, so one of them has to die? How does your system handle that? And I want to ask, well, how does socialism handle that? How does a democracy handle that? I mean, this is just a tragedy that you set up, and there's no good answer. So just because libertarianism doesn't, fly today's system or regular, how are children treated now? They're forced to go to school, right? So they're basically quasi slaves. They're subject to conscription as soon as they turn 18. They're subject to imprisonment if they smoke weed. They're propagandized and brainwashed by public schools, indoctrination, right? Their education is subpar, so they become menial workers. They have to go to college to get a reasonable degree of knowledge, and then they incur hundreds of thousands of dollars of debt because the government's ruined that. So children are totally screwed in today's society because of the state. So this worry, how can children be protected without the state, is just ridiculous. It assumes that they're protected now. I mean, they're not protected now. What is that? What are you talking about? Now, I think that in an anarchist society, that children would be seen as living human beings with rights, and they would be subject to the same protection as other people. They would be treated at a young age, just like they're treated now, as being not having full capacity yet. So the natural caretaker, which is usually their parents, would have the ability to make decisions for them that are reasonable. If your child has tonsil, has an appendicitis or has some medical problem and they need surgery, the parents should be able to consent to that, even though the child doesn't know what's going on. But you shouldn't be able to commit radical, what do you call it, female. If you do that, that's child abuse, and they should be taken away, just like they should be taken away now. But how many girls now are subject to genital mutilation around the world? I think millions. And we live in a world dominated by states. So they're not protected now. So I don't really see the problem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess my my next question is, if I'm thinking of the term Rothbard or Hoppe uses correctly, like a rational self-owner, at what point does a child go from being like, obviously we can't draw an objective age for this, everything seems arbitrary. Do we say they have capacity to do these things at 14, at 17, or maybe they can get a job at 14, but obviously they can't consent to sex yet with like a 30-year-old. Those are like different scenarios, right? So like, where do we draw the lines about these things? Would it just like you have a market of law and this problem, I guess, has posed itself to me that I don't see like a strict answer to.
Well, I don't think, and this is the problem. The objective is this. One reason they like legislation is because they desire certainty, and sometimes they desire certainty more than they desire a just result. Like, as long as there's a goddamn answer given to you by the courts or by the legislature, that's better than having. See, they crave some objective lines. I don't think there are clear-cut lines. There are lines in principle, but they depend upon function. If you assume an anarchist society, which is composed mostly by people that value human liberty and rights, and they're rational, then these types of people would tend to attribute the similar rights to children, and they would have the similar views as to what we have now in society. Most people think children do have rights and they shouldn't be abused, and the same thing would happen in a free society. In fact, even more so. I think the value of life would be even higher because people would be more consistent in their love of liberty and human rights and all this. Yeah, you could have a case where someone lives on a ranch far away from civilization and they abuse their child. Of course, that can happen now. That's just like a lifeboat scenario. In principle, I believe that someone's abusing their baby or their young child. In principle, even in a free society, you could have relatives or concerned people who speak for the child basically invade the property and liberate the child. I have no problem with that, which is what happens now with child protective services and things like that. So I think you would have an analog of that in a libertarian society. It wouldn't work in every case, just like it doesn't work in every case now. as for when children have rights, I think they have rights from the moment that they're born, or at least when they start speaking. But I think that they're subject to their guardians' care until they reach a certain age where they're more or less self-sufficient, independent actors in society. And that can happen at a very young age, depending upon the child. I mean, Rothbard's paradigm is as soon as a child can say no and try to run away. And I tend to agree with that. If you have a 7-year-old child who is living in such horrible circumstances with their family that they want to manumit themselves or choose a different caretaker, I think their wishes should be taken into account.
Okay. What I find, I do generally agree with the position that you just presented. And I kind of thought about this before, but never in the words that you said. Essentially, like, just craving this objectivity, or this that nothing is allowed to be arbitrary, right? Like, it's just like, but some things don't have just this absolute answer to them. And what's funny is I remember speaking with this objectivist, Mr. Cropper. He's on YouTube, about objectivism and anarchy, and he kept calling me a utopian whenever I would present like these ideas. And then, but it almost seems to me it's far more utopian to believe that there is an objective answer to all of these questions.
Well, see, that's the thing. So you could say that in an anarchist society with no legislation and people going by intuitions and custom and court decisions and arbitration decisions and things like that, that it's not precise where the line is. But sit here in our rational minds and our best efforts as a group of concerned, peace-loving people who respect the rights of children, if we can't figure it out, well, they can't figure it out either. All they can do is have a law that gives you a number. Like now the number is 18, or lower numbers for other things. Like, at a certain age, I don't know, if you're 16 in some states, if your parents consent, you can get married. Or at age 14, you can go to court and ask the court to manumit you. But those are fixed, predictable numbers, but they're just arbitrary. There's no reason to believe that they're the just, objectively correct answer. They're just an answer.
Right. And
I'm not sure why an answer is better than no answer if the answer is not correct.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I tend to agree with you wholeheartedly, and I get, I wouldn't say chastise, but when you're talking to somebody like, say, like a normie or like a neocon or something, and they bring up these contentions, and a lot of times it almost seems like a whataboutism or a deflection, just to say, well, these problems are arbitrarily solved in today's society. But some of these people, like for like the normal person, they're like, well, I would rather have an answer. I don't care if it's arbitrary.
Well, the other way to think about this is when people pepper you with questions, sometimes they're arguing tendentiously, or they're not really interested in the answer. It's a rhetorical question or a loaded question, or it's just the beginning of an endless stream of questions. Like they want to keep demanding answers from you until you can't give them an answer, and then they can use that as an excuse to reject your theory. So they could say, well, I see this in intellectual property all the time. Someone will say, well, in your, how one can just rip. So I'll say, well, I think, you could sell the first novel and then get a legion of followers, and then you could make them prepay for the second sequel. J.K. Rowling could have done that with Harry Potter. Or maybe you get a consulting fee for consulting on a movie being made, so you'll get more of the fans will watch that movie instead of a pirated movie. So then you can come up with a plausible explanation of how J.K. Rowling could be a multimillionaire even in a society without copyright law. But then the person asking you that, they'll say, okay, what about a poet? It's like, okay, now I've got to answer that question. And then if you answer that question, they'll say, okay, well, what about a software programmer? I mean, they just will never stop. It's very similar to welfare statist Democrat liberals who think that everyone has a right to an education and to food and a job and a house and money. And if they ask you, well, how would the poor be taken care of in your society? And you say, well, I guess there would be charity. And they'll say, well, can you guarantee that there'll be charity? And I'll say, no. They'll say, well, then I reject your system, even though welfare can't be guaranteed in their system either, because we're going bankrupt and Social Security is going to be not available when you guys get old. We all know that, right? So their systems aren't a guarantee either. So
Right.
they come up with these false standards that we have to meet that their system doesn't have to meet.
Yeah, I agree. It's like you can point out 100 problems with statism or in general, but all they have to do is find their one problem with anarchism or whatever it may be, and in their minds they're like, this is it. This is the one thing we need the state for. We have to have it. All these other things, war and devaluing people's money and throwing them in jail for harmless things. It's worth it as long as people can go to public school and get a terrible education.
Well, I was talking to my friend Seyfuddin Ammous the other day. The guy that wrote the Bitcoin Standard,
mm-hmm.
And I said, how would you imagine in the future, like if we have we have humans living off Earth, like on the moon or on Mars, or colonies outside the Earth, where the speed of light means that you can't even communicate in 10 minutes with each other. How would they be integrated into the Bitcoin network? Because the blockchain is updated every 10 minutes, and how would that work? He just laughs. He goes, I don't worry about these issues because we're trying to come up with a money that works for the world that we live in right now. I mean, how would the U.S. dollar work across extraterrestrial civilizations? It's sort of like something we can worry about in 500 years.
Right. Yeah, so another one that usually gets brought up, and it's kind of in the same vein as we've already talked about. And I know you already mentioned like things like genital mutilation in the Middle East, and well, I mean, it even happens in America. Children circumcised without. But regardless, one typically is like, well, what if the market decides that they aren't going to enforce children's rights, and say like, okay, so say that you have this market and law, and they've just decided that they're not going to enforce against having sex with children. You can have sex with children, and people can even try and take you to arbitration. But these agencies, they're because of the people in the area, they've got deep pockets. They say, well, we're not gonna we'll pay you to not enforce this, and we're not gonna enforce having sex with children.
So I would say to that, I say, well, what's to prevent your democratic society from not respecting children's rights? I mean, what if the majority of people don't want to respect children's rights, and they vote in people that write the laws and they don't respect children's rights? I mean, what's the guarantee? I would ask, where's the better chance for children's rights to be respected? In a society like we have now, where the state is a criminal organization that feels free to treat people like it's slaves, which it does. We're all basically enslaved by the tax system and by the threat of conscription and federal prison, in jail. Where children, as I mentioned earlier, are already abused in a number of ways. It's lucky that anyone comes out sane that's born into this modern society, or a society which is based upon voluntarism and peace and respect for human life. Which society is more likely to respect children and give them a better chance? I think it's to ask us to answer. I think it's obvious.
Right. To get back onto the realm of justification, the reason I brought up my thing earlier is I wanted to make sure we'd have time for it, and hopefully I like I said, I just kind of conceptualized it today. Hopefully, like I could maybe provide you with some further proofs and stuff over email, and we could talk about this. But I did want to ask you about like your estoppel justification. I don't think many people are familiar with that. If you could like just give like I read part of the chapter 5 of Dialectics of Liberty, but I still was wondering if we could get like a basic representation of your estoppel justification for property rights.
Yeah, so I was already a libertarian from influenced by Rand, but I think that's just because for those of us who we do for some reason value peace and prosperity and harmony, and we know a little bit about economics, you basically realize that the free market and a free society is the means to achieve these things, right? That's why we're libertarians. That's why most people are basically libertarian in a soft sense, most human beings. That's why society is possible. That's why we have civilization. That's why the private law that governs most of our daily interactions is roughly libertarian. You know, murder is prohibited, theft is prohibited, private property is respected. Now, there are exceptions made for the state, but people regard them as exceptions. And I had been influenced by some of the natural rights or natural law type reasoning of Ayn Rand and these people. But then in law school, I had read Hoppe's argumentation ethics, which is this sort of transcendental approach, right? Which is showing that the denial of rights is a contradiction because it contradicts the normative presuppositions of discourse per se. So that idea intrigued me and fascinated me. And around the same time, I was in contracts class in law school, in which I learned about this theory, this legal doctrine of estoppel, which is something that's used in court proceedings to prevent someone from making a claim if it contradicts an action they took earlier that someone else relied upon. It's sort of an idea of equity or fairness, where well, we can give examples, but you get the idea. So I instantly saw intuitively that type of reasoning could flesh out the symmetry that's built into the libertarian non-aggression principle. So the libertarian case is basically that it's not that force is impermissible or even violence. It's just that it's only permissible when it's in response to force, right? So you can never initiate force, but if someone initiates force against you, you can respond or retaliate or defend yourself. So your defensive force is justified, but it's only justified in response to force, which is why laws against speech or against religious views are unjust, because the law always uses force to enforce the law, but it's being directed against someone who didn't use force. Like if I merely hold a religious view that's unpopular, or I say something that's reprehensible or unpopular, I'm not using force. So the law being applied against me is asymmetrical. So we libertarians, there's a certain symmetry.
I'm sorry. I thought of something while you were talking, but I totally forgot about it. Give me just a second. If anybody else wants to ask anything, obviously, feel free.
Yeah, I wanted to ask regarding the estoppel argument. So you say that the rights denier can't really deny the quote unquote right for A to enforce his right, right? The implementation of his right is his own doing. But what if B decided to say that he has a right to something and then implement it by the use of force? How would you combat that? Like, how would you object to that?
Wait, give me the hypo again. Explain it.
So if B decided that he had a right to something, and he decided to use force to implement it, how would you combat that, even though if you deny that he has a right to it, and he still enforces it, then he quote unquote has a right to it. He's just implementing his right.
Who is B in this example?
It's in your part about right skepticism, about how A can legitimately use force against B to enforce the right. So the right is the implementation of it by the doer. But what stops B from enforcing something that he believes is a right?
Is B the good guy or the bad guy in this case? I forgot.
He was the bad guy in this case, but what stops him from enforcing something that he believes to be a right?
Nothing stops him. So this is the point that rights are normative. They're prescriptive. They're not descriptive. So that's why I mentioned dualism earlier. They're just like in economics, in Austrian economics, in praxeological economics of Mises in particular. There's a distinction between the teleological realm of human action, right? Laws that are laws that are laws that have to do with human purpose of human action, and the causal laws that have to do with the laws of nature, like the scientific laws between objects. These are different realms of thought, and likewise, no, they're not descriptive of world of matter, rights. It's possible to do something that's wrong, which is why we oppose them, because you can't undo it. I mean, once it's done, the damage has been done and cannot be undone. The victim of a rights violation can only do what he can do, which is to retaliate in some kind of way, hopefully get some kind of restitution. But even restitution never undoes the fact that his rights were violated. Hopefully, in any society, there are mechanisms in place that reduce the likelihood of this. In today's society, we have the police. Now, they're not totally effective, and in fact, they're sometimes our rights violators. And in a private society, you would have self-defense. Someone could use physical force to defend themselves, and they could have an agent that they had hired to help defend themselves, and they could use armor or locks on their doors or weapons to try to stop it. But the prevailing hope is that the more advanced and civilized society gets, the more widespread is the notion and the belief that aggression is wrong, and therefore 99% of society all agrees with you, and they would come to your aid. The legal system would be on your side. There would be ostracism. There would be punishment. There would be outlawry. There would be defense mechanisms, and also you have to understand that by and large, the civilized, peaceful people would tend to be richer and more powerful than the criminals, because they're abiding by the rules and they're being productive, so they acquire more assets. Criminals usually are lowlifes and stupid and high time preference people. So they're always going to be a minor threat. I don't think you can ever eliminate crime because of economics. Suppose you had a society of complete peace and docility, and everyone was a good neighbor. People would stop bothering to lock their doors, right? They would worry about it. Just like some people today, because of thing, and it's high because it's easy to rob people who don't even lock their doors. So I think that the more peaceful the society is, the less likely it is that you eliminate it completely. So there's no guarantee that you'll ever get rid of crime forever. It's always possible to violate rights. So physical measures to defend yourself, as well as belief systems, right, spreading as widely as possible, will tend to the amount of crime that can be perpetrated and gotten away with.
I had a question of a hypothetical that Walter Block told us about, and I feel like you're going to have a different answer than he did. And he says that, so say you're standing in the middle of the road with somebody, and a truck is coming your way. And you see that the truck's coming on your way, and it's going to hit your friend. You push your friend out of the way so that to stop him, and he rolls into a pond, and he doesn't know how to swim. Now he's drowning. Are you obligated to save him?
Oh, I've never heard that hypothetical.
Walter Block says no.
Yeah.
Because he has no positive right, and you were acting with intention of increasing it. You were acting to save his life. However, I find this to be a slippery slope, because I can, if we just base things off of intent, I can say a lot of things. I was intending to increase these people's positions by doing this. It doesn't matter that I was violating, but pushing him obviously is some menial form of rights violation. So I would like to.
So here's how I look at that one. Yeah, before other hypos I've heard before, but here's how I would analyze that. I actually do agree with Walter on this one. Most people bring something like this up in the spanking debate. Like I oppose spanking. I don't know if it's quite aggression, but I think it's definitely wrong, and it's ineffective. And if it's severe, I think it is a rights violation. child. People that are these banking because they're troglodytes, so they don't think about anything, and their parents did it to them. They say stupid shit like, "Oh, I was spanked and I turned out fine." You know, I'm so sick of that stupid argument. Sometimes okay to use aggression. For example, if your child is running into busy traffic, you can grab him and commit aggression. So they think that's aggression. I don't think that's aggression. That's the flaw in the reasoning. I think that if you physically grab someone to save them from something that they don't know is about to happen to them, then I think that we would treat that as an act of you're doing it by consent, by the implied consent, because most people would consent to that happening. See, this kind of overly legalistic view says that, well, your friend or a stranger in the street is about to be run over by a bus and you grab them. So yes, you're committing aggression, but you have to hope that they would forgive you after the fact, or a jury wouldn't punish you too much for it. I think it's bullshit. I think the same thing that motivates Good Samaritan statutes, which absolves you of negligent liability, if you try to save someone like who's having a heart attack and you give them CPR and they die because you didn't do it right, I think you shouldn't be liable for that because you're trying to save them. I think the point is, in cases where you don't have time to ask them what's happening because it's an emergency, you have to go with the default presumption about what most people would prefer. And most people would prefer that you grab them and you yank them out of the way of a bus. So I would say if you grab someone or push them to save them from an accident, you're doing it with their consent, even if it's implied consent. So if you push someone into a lake maliciously on purpose, you're committing aggression because they didn't consent to it, and then you do have a positive obligation to rescue them. Okay, and I think Walter agrees with me on that. This is part of my argument that abortion is not necessarily the right of the mother, because the fetus is not a trespasser because she invited the fetus into her womb by having sex, in most cases. But so if you put someone in a position of peril by committing a tort against them, by pushing them into a lake, you do have an obligation to rescue them. But if someone says, "Hey, push me into the lake," and they consent to it and you do it, and then they can't swim, I don't think you have an obligation to rescue them under the law. Morally you would, but not under the law. And likewise, if you rescue them from a bus about to hit them by pushing them, again, you're doing it with their implied consent. So if they fall into a lake and they're about to drown, well, they implicitly consented to being pushed, and now something bad is happening to them, but that's because they consented to it. So you don't have an obligation to rescue them. Can't hear you.
Can you guys hear me?
Yeah, you're good. You're good.
Okay. Sorry. There's another one I thought about when you brought up the Good Samaritan laws, and I hadn't thought about this before. So say you're in a restaurant and somebody drops down on the ground, they're having a heart attack, and you perform CPR on them, and in the midst of saving their life, performing CPR, you break 3 of their ribs. Or do you have to pay for them to get their ribs fixed?
No, that's why I gave the example earlier about if you're rescuing someone and they get damaged by it, or you do a bad job of it, unless you're doing it on purpose, no. I mean, if there's 3 guys in the room and one's more qualified and you don't let him do it, maybe in that case, but by and large. And by the way, you gave an example of a restaurant. So this is a case where there's a private property, and presume there's an owner restaurant, and the owner of private property on which third parties are present can more or less set some of the ground rules, right? So what are the rules of the restaurant? I would say the default rules, or maybe the explicit rules on a sign hanging on the wall, is that if you enter this restaurant, you consent to people doing reasonable things to save you in the case of an emergency, because that's how most people think.
Right.
So no, I don't think, because I think you did it with consent of the person, the implied consent or the explicit consent, if that's the ground rules of the restaurant.
Right. Okay. And yeah, I
now
think
if someone want you to save me. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, you can go ahead with what you were going to say.
I was going to say, if you do it without their consent, like someone doesn't want to be resuscitated, like they're in the hospital, they're on a life support, and they say, I don't want to be resuscitated, and you do it anyway, I think you're violating their rights because you're not doing it with their consent. But if you don't know, and the default presumption is most people would want that, then you can safely assume and go by that presumption. Because there's a communicative aspect to all rights. If you think about having a right, a property right, all rights are property rights. It's a property right over the resource that you own or your body. Okay. The way that we distinguish between an act of aggression and something else is by the consent of the person. So if I kiss a girl who invited it by her conduct or by her words, then it's not an act of battery.
Right.
But if I kiss her when she doesn't want it, it's an act of battery. Okay, it's an act of aggression. So how do we know if she consented? She has to communicate it. Now she can communicate it in a number of ways. She can communicate it by her looks. By her look, she might give you a look. It might be the default presumption of the date or the custom of your relationship with her, or she might say it, right? There's any number of ways you can communicate things because human language and communication is done in a subtle way or in lots of ways. So it's just an empirical question of what was communicated. Now, if you live in an area where the custom is that everyone rescues people when they have a problem, then unless you change that default presumption, then you are in effect communicating something. So if you live in a neighborhood where everyone knocks on neighbors' doors on occasion to ask a favor or to ask for a cup of coffee, to ask for a cup of sugar, to make a meal, something like that, then unless you put up a posted sign saying no one is welcome to knock on my door to ask for a cup of sugar, then when they do knock on it, you can't say that they're using your doorknob. It's not an act of trespass because you've implicitly consented to it by not changing the default presumption that's being communicated by your participation in this community. So a lot of libertarians are opposed to implicit contracts, but it's unavoidable because of the nature of communication and the nature of language. Language is always non-complete, and there always have to be gap fillers or what we call suppletive provisions, ways of determining what people communicated. If a guy's been dating a girl for a year and he always kisses her at the end of the date, and she even told him, you can kiss me whenever you want, then if he dates her, he hasn't seen her in a week, and he takes her on a date and he goes over to kiss her, he's going by her last standing order in a sense, by assuming that she consented. She didn't just say you can kiss me, but she had consented previously. Now, she can change her mind, but she has to do it. She has to communicate that. She can't just internally think, I hereby renounce my consent. If the guy doesn't know it, if she hasn't communicated it to him, he's entitled to rely upon the last known communication or the communication she's giving by her actions.
Hey, I'm back. Sorry, my internet died. The internet guy just got here, so I'm back on my phone. So from what I gathered before my internet went out was that based off of like the for the most, yeah, so that wouldn't be a rights violation if you were you were acting to save the person based off of either implicit consent or what was the other term, like essentially if they agree to go into the restaurant on the terms that if they were in this situation, then somebody can save them.
Yeah, well, the ground rules of the establishment as promulgated by the owner.
Right. So
if you enter a boxing ring owned by someone else, and it's meant to be a boxing ring where people fight each other, and you step into the ring and there's a boxer there and he starts punching you, I mean, you've consented to it.
Right.
Even if you didn't say I consent to boxing, you step into a ring where it's understood that, or a football field, you play football and you're going to be tackled.
Right.
That's not aggression.
Right. I think this one's pretty straightforward. I just want to hear somebody say this, but would the Hunger Games be possible under a voluntary society? Like voluntarily agreeing to participate in Hunger Games?
That's a tricky question. Well, I was going to start a blog at one point about 15 years ago called Murder Park, based upon Walter Block's idea that you could have Murder Park, which is like some enclosed Hunger Games type facility where you enter and it's all holds barred. You can kill each other. I guess technically you could do. I guess you might have difficult questions about if you enter the arena. I suppose you could try to escape, but I mean, what if one of the rules was people are going to get changed in their mind just so they can trick you and stab you in the back. And so basically, once you enter this arena, it's like a war. You enter a battlefield, it's too late to really change your mind.
Right. I think.
So I think it's possible. I think it's possible to have such a thing. Now, I do not think that voluntary slavery is enforceable.
Okay, that's what I was going to ask next. Because Walter Block would essentially say, I think what his answer here would be that if you changed your mind, well, you had already contractually agreed to go in there and battle to the death. You can't change your mind. That would be a breach of contract.
Right. And Walter is wrong and confused on this because Walter thinks that he adheres to Rothbard's theories, but part of Rothbard's theory is a revised view of what contracts are and his reformulation of contracts. And basically, his view is that contracts are not binding promises or obligations, which is how the law today does conceive of contracts, which I think is erroneous. As I said before, the nature of aggression is using someone's property, including their body, without their consent. So contract is just how an owner of a resource decides to consent or not to someone using it. So a contract, you could think of even the girl consenting to being kissed, or the guy consenting to being pushed in a ring, or someone consenting to being operated on by a surgeon for an operation. Those are all contracts because it's the owner consenting to certain things being done to the resource that they own. Now, by the same token, you can not only give someone temporary permission to use your resource for limited purposes, you can make it general and you can make it permanent, which would be a typical contract of sale. Like you just sell the resource completely to someone. But it's not a binding promise. It's just a transfer of title by consent of the resource to someone else. But I think that is not possible in the case of your body. It's possible in the case of resources that you own, and because of the way you come to own these things, they're different. You own a resource because you acquired it. It was a previously unowned thing out in the world that no one owned, and then someone started using it and became the owner. And they're the owner because they were the first one to use it, or because they got it by contract from someone else. But you own your body not because you homesteaded it. You own it because you're the direct controller of it. So it's impossible to alienate control of your body by just saying, I promise to be your slave. You can always change your mind. Just like the girl on a date who's always been kissed can if the guy goes to kiss her, she can say, no, don't kiss me. At that point, she's changed her mind and she's entitled to change her mind. And if he kisses her then, he can't say, well, you consented last week. Well, the most recent consent is the most recent communication that's relevant. So she can change her mind. The reason she can change her mind is because it doesn't commit aggression against him to change her mind.
So when he says like voluntary slavery, I think like, so an example he specifically gives, and I want to hear your thoughts on this. He says, well, if I'm walking on a tightrope and I hire you to hold a trampoline under me to make sure that if I fall, there's the trampoline. And if you decide halfway through this contractually agreed agreement that you're going to, pick up and leave and grab the trampoline and leave, that I can, up on the tightrope, point a gun at you and voluntarily enslave you to make sure you stay there and complete your contract?
I think if you have the option not to jump on the trip, if you have the option to not jump on the trampoline, I think that's not true. That's false. You just have to someone up. Now, if you're falling through the air and it's too late, and then the guy moves the trampoline or refuses to put it under you, I think then you could say he's playing a causal role, because it's too late for them to change their mind at that point. That's a difficult issue. I think also you could make an argument for that, like an airline pilot on an airplane. You hire an airline pilot to fly you, up in the air. He can change his mind up until he flies the plane. Like if he backs out of the contract right before the flight takes off, you could sue him for money damages if he agreed to pay money damages for not flying the plane, because money damages are alienable and they're transferable by contract. But he can't be considered to be an aggressor because he changed his mind. However, once you get up in the air, he's the only person who can fly the plane, and if he bails out of the plane in a parachute, he's basically killing everyone. So they've relied upon his being the pilot, and he can't. It's too late for them to avoid the damage. So I would say in that case, you could compel him to fly the plane. But in the case of Murder Park, I think, so I would look at it like this. It's possible to make yourself someone's slave if you do it physically. And I think the word Rothbard uses, or Walter, is zombify yourself. Just like it's possible to kill yourself, you could take a gun and shoot your brains out. You can kill yourself. And then you could sell your body. You could have sold your body by your will to some medical institute or something like that, in exchange for money being to your kids, because your body at that point is an inert object. But if you contracted to kill yourself, you could always change your mind. But just like it's possible to physically, like if you could put a chip in your brain that makes you someone's physical slave, that is possible too. That would be legitimate. Okay. But if you can change your mind, and if you do it, then you're not violating a contract, because you can't have a contract about that. By the same token, if you had a murder park constructed so you have these walls, and once you enter, you're in there with a bunch of people, you just can't escape physically, and there's no way to communicate your change of mind, because let's say you have tape over your mouth or something like that. I guess you could construct a scenario where you could have a murder park that Walter envisions, but it's not because you sold your body. It's just because you put yourself in a situation where you might be killed.
I see.
And by the way, Walter and I had a podcast on my podcast. We had a debate here in this very house. He was visiting me. We sat on the couch and had a debate about this voluntary slavery thing. So it's on my podcast feed early on, about episode 5, 6, 7, something like that, where I tried to persuade him and he tried to persuade me, and we stuck to our positions. But I think he's wrong on this issue.
Where do you stand on the line of thick versus thin libertarian?
I stand on that almost like I stand on the left-right issue, like left libertarians and right libertarians and the left-right spectrum. I reject the whole spectrum because I think in terms of degrees of statism or socialism, and I think that the left and the right are both just different types of socialist. And I think that the left-right spectrum is dishonest and incoherent. I think the entire thick-thin debate is loaded and dishonest and disingenuous by assuming that there's something to it and that we have to either be thick or thin. I think all human beings live in the real world, and we have a variety of values and beliefs, and they're almost all interrelated, but they're separate and distinct. I think libertarianism is a political philosophy about what rights that we have and what laws should exist. And I don't think that being a libertarian, so-called quote unquote, entails, like as Roderick Long argues, it entails a belief that you shouldn't quote boss people around, which is a broader value, which could lead you to be a left libertarian against corporations and capitalism and employers and all this crap. Um, uh, and to the extent that they think they have something profound to say by pushing this stupid thickism narrative, I think that they're trying to take credit for common sense that everyone knows that that it's important. For example, if you're a libertarian, to know a little bit about economics and logic, like you need to know about consistency. You need to value truth. I think truth is a good thing. If you don't value truth, how can you get to the truth of a matter about what rights we have? But that doesn't mean that libertarianism is the same as truth or the same as economics. You need to have language to communicate these ideas and to think about things, right? So it doesn't mean it's the same as language. They buttress each other. We're not just libertarians, we're human beings, and you couldn't be a libertarian without having language and living in society and having food, and being healthy and valuing truth and even valuing honesty to some degree. But I think they're distinct. And I think that libertarianism is a narrow idea about what uses of force between people are justified and which aren't. So I think, for example, you could argue that some cases of standing on your rights and enforcing your rights are immoral. And you could also argue that it's sometimes moral to violate rights because morality and rights are different things. So, for example, if I'm in the woods and I have a baby who's starving and we're about to die and there's a cabin someone has and I can break in and get a can of soup, maybe it's immoral not to violate the guy's rights, but it still would be violating his rights. And there are cases where standing on your rights is immoral. I have a right to break my grandmother's heart by insulting her, but it doesn't mean that it's a moral thing to do. So morality and interpersonal laws and ethics and rights are distinct, I believe.
Yeah, I have another question. And by the way, I didn't know like how long you were okay with us talking to you, but if you got to go or anything, just let us know. But if not, I definitely still have some more questions.
I think another 15, 20 minutes I can go.
Okay. One would be a lot of the people when they scrutinize the idea of like the NAP, and they think about things like risk, right? And I typically usually give a pretty straightforward answer to this, and I just want to make sure I'm assessing this correctly. And somebody says like, oh, if somebody whips out a revolver, and there's only and spins a revolver and there's only one bullet in it, is this an act of aggression? There's only a 15% chance that or 20% chance, whatever, that the bullet is when they pull the trigger is the one they're going to shoot you with. And typically I say, well, the act of aggression is the fact that they're pointing a revolver at me, not whether it's loaded or not. Because really and truly, I don't really know whether when somebody comes up to me and says, give me your money, I don't know whether that gun could be totally unloaded. If somebody comes up and puts a knife to my throat, I'm not concerned with whether the knife is dull or not. All I know is this person is threatening me with a weapon. That's typically what I say. I say it loaded or not. The act of aggression is the fact that they're pointing a weapon at me with threatening intent.
So the way I look at this is, I think that the concept of aggression, the non-aggression principle, is not really technically a description of all of our views. It's like a type of metonymy or a suggestive. It's a description of part of what we believe, but it's used to stand in for the rest. Aggression really means invading the borders of someone else's body with physical force without their consent, right? So when we try to say the non-aggression principle covers that, but it also covers trespass to other resources you own, or fraud, then it's a little bit of a misuse of an analogy, because if you walk across someone's lawn at night when they're sleeping, is it really aggression? It's not really invading the borders of their property. What it is using their resource without their consent. Now, the reason they have a right to that yard is because of an extension See, non-aggression principle is another way of saying you have property rights in your body. Okay, they're the same statement. Saying I'm the owner of my body is the same thing as saying I'm against aggression. Those are equivalent statements. Okay, but so when you say you're against aggression, you mean people should have property rights in their body. But by extension, we can say, and that can be extended to rights and other things. So then estoppel and rights, and in some other blog posts since then, I tried to explain why threats count as a type of aggression. To my mind, aggression is an action to which force is legitimately used, right? So I go backwards from what most people say. They try to prove what their rights are and then say, therefore, because you have a right, force is legitimate in response to it. My reasoning goes backwards. I say, when is force justified? Whenever force is justified, whatever you're using the force against is itself necessarily aggression, right? And so that's why in estoppel I say you're entitled to use force against someone who used force against you because they used it and because they were stopped from objecting to force being used against them. They've effectively consented already, and therefore that proves that what they did was aggression, right? Because aggression is the thing that we can use force against. So in the case of a threat, or in the law, it's called assault. That's why I used the word battery earlier. Most people say assault and battery as a combination, but really in the law, assault and battery are different things. They always go together because assault is one of two things. Battery is an offensive touching. That's like an invasion of someone's body. So like if I actually shoot someone, that's an assault, that's a battery. But assault is either an attempt at battery, which is where your risk hypo would play in, or it is putting someone in reasonable fear of receiving a battery. So if I point a loaded gun at you and I say, give me your money or I'm going to shoot you, then that's the second type. That's putting you in fear of receiving a battery. That's called extortion or coercion. And the reason it's a type of aggression is because when you point a gun at me and you threaten me like that, I'm entitled to retaliate if I can. Like I'm entitled to pull my gun out and plug you. Like I don't have to wait until I'm hurt to hurt you back. I'm entitled. You put me in a position where I'm about to receive some damage and I can defend myself. And because I'm justified in defending myself, that proves that the act of threat is a type of aggression. Because we can only respond legitimately to aggression. Now,
okay.
Suppose someone's sleeping and I have a loaded gun and I point it at them and I shoot them, or I shoot at them, but I miss. That's attempted murder or attempted battery. And I think that's a type of aggression too, because that also can be punished. Now, it's possible you could argue that the punishment would be less severe. Like if I shoot a gun at you and I don't kill you, let's say we have a gun with 6 chambers and I only have 1 bullet in it, and I spin it randomly and I point at you and I pull the trigger and it clicks. Well, I would say that's assault in both senses of the word. It puts me in fear of receiving a battery, and it's an attempt. So I think you can punish the guy maybe less severely than you would punish him if he had actually succeeded in shooting you, but you can punish him to some degree, proportionally to what he's done. You can basically put him in fear of receiving a battery. So maybe you can take a gun loaded with 6 bullets and you can point it at him and pull the trigger, and whatever happens, happens.
That's kind of what Walter Block says is you have like this reciprocity thing. You have like, so say I steal your shirt. Not only do I have to give you back your shirt, he says I have to give you another shirt, and I have to, there has to be some sort of factor for making up the fear factor of you running up and ripping my shirt off of me. And he said whether that's
his two teeth for a tooth argument.
Yeah.
I think that gets at the right idea. I don't think it's technically right. It's a little too formulaic. It's a little bit too armchair theorizing. It loses sight of 2 types of aggression. One is like the theft of a resource that you own that you can recover. Like someone steals your watch. Let's say you get the watch back. I think you're entitled to get the watch back, not as punishment, but just because you own it. But then you're entitled to do something back to the guy for the aggression that he committed, which was using your watch without permission, incur costs of putting you in imposing suffering, pain and damages and suffering on you, all those kinds of things. And that might or might not be the same as taking his watch back, but it's some kind of extra punishment.
Mm-hmm.
But if someone just commits an act of aggression, like they punch you or they rape you, or they kill your child or your wife, there's nothing to get back. So you're entitled to do back to them something proportionate to what they did, and maybe even a little bit more. So I don't think it's a formulaic 2 teeth for a tooth, but the logic is basically right, or roughly right.
I was hoping to ask you 2 more kind of absurd hypotheticals, just because they've been posed to me before, and I'd be interested to see how you answered them.
Right.
One would be, so say you don't live in a covenant community that says no nuclear weapons. Your insurance company allows it, or you don't have insurance, whatever. So you have this nuclear weapon in your basement, and it has a 99% chance of exploding, and you know it. Are you aggressing on your neighbors?
My intuition says yes.
But
yeah.
but it's weird, because it's like, what point do you make the arbitrary distinction? Is if it's 1%, 50%, 75%, where do you make that distinction between it not being aggression and it being aggression?
Yeah, I think that well, I think the problem would take care of itself in the sense that he would not get insurance, and he would be ostracized, and therefore he'd be an outcast. And these types of people don't tend to have enough resources to have such things in the first place. So it wouldn't be a big problem in general. I think we have to recognize a couple things. By merely living, we are some risk to each other, just by breathing in and out, by living around, partly because the future is unpredictable and we have free will. I don't know that I'm not going to choose to become a mass murderer in a year, right? So just by living with each other, we are all somewhat of a risk to each other. And therefore, no one can complain about the mere fact of risk in general, per se, because we're risks to other people. And so you can't complain that other people are somewhat of a risk to you because they're unpredictable and because they have free will, because they're autonomous agents and they might do danger to you. So the mere possibility that they could do danger to program activity, because that we would all have to kill ourselves. So like an airplane flying overhead, there's some risk that it could crash on your house, but it's not a likely risk and it's not certain. So I think there's a certain degree of tolerance of some background level of risk that we all have to not object to by virtue of living in a world where there's risk and there's other people.
Mm-hmm.
But it obviously gets to a certain point where it's so high of a risk that it rises to the level of threat. And this is another one of those points where it's hard to draw a number on it or put a precise line on it. I think you can only go by social custom and what neighbors are willing to tolerate. I mean, if the guy's got a nuclear weapon and all the neighbors get so nervous about it, and the guy refuses to get insurance and abide by his insurance company's agreement, and he's hell-bent on just doing his experiments, even though it endangers the whole town, and a group of neighbors have finally had it, and they just come into his property and they dismantle the bomb, I guess you have to ask, if the guy sues them in court for trespass, what would the jury say? The jury's going to be composed of your fellow man, the same people that are afraid of this guy in the first place. I don't think that they're going to basically side with him. So at a certain point, that's why I think there's a little bit to this idea of mutualism, which I know has left libertarian barnacles attached to it. Something that, just like we say rights aren't self-enforcing, we do have to live with each other. And if you're a complete misanthrope and malcontent and you're always being a pain in the ass to people, at a certain point, they're not going to assist you in having your rights enforced, because you don't really have a right to have your rights enforced. Right? If you can't do it yourself, you have to count on the goodwill of your right. And not only that, you at a certain you can't even expect them rights. Libertarianism and mutualism to a certain degree has a certain role to play. You have to basically be somewhat of a cooperative member of society if you want to take part in society.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, the way I conceive of it is we all own our property and we don't have positive rights to go on each other's property. So in order to live cohesively within society and be able to travel freely from my house to my job, well, I have to be amicable with my neighbors and the road owners and the people of my community so that they let me come on and off of their property so I can get to work and get to the grocery store and you know live in a peaceful society. That's kind of how I see of it.
Yeah,
because we don't have positive rights to move.
I mean, this is not a common problem. Yeah, you don't. I think if this became a widespread problem, then people would they would start adopting mechanisms where people that people need. I'm saying you have to carry a passport saying you're a good citizen, but people would tend to have white lists or blacklists of people where societal penalties would fall so harshly on these people that they wouldn't be able to do anything. They wouldn't be able to trade. They wouldn't be able to get a job. They wouldn't be able to bank in the system. They wouldn't be able to travel on the private roads. They would be so ostracized that the threat would be just squashed.
Yeah. And my last question would be if your car had a 99% chance of blowing up and you invite your friend into the car and you get on the road and you drive and you get to your destination. You didn't tell them this. And you get out of the car. It didn't blow up. Thankfully, you get to their house. He gets out and everything, and then he finds out you had a bomb in the back of the car with a 99% chance of blowing it up. He didn't detonate it or anything. It's not like he had a detonator. It just had a random chance of 99% of blowing up. Would that have been an act of aggression against the friend? I know these are just weird, totally out there hypotheticals.
I think so. I think it would be. I would say it's analogous to a threat. Or I say analogous to an attempt to assault. It'd be an attempt to hurt someone because it's likely to do it. I mean, why are you inviting him in your car that's 99% likely to blow up and not telling him if you basically want him to be blown up? I mean,
right.
So you're trying to blow him up. Is what you're doing.
Right. Okay.
You know, if you shoot a missile into someone across the battlefield, I doubt that the likelihood of killing someone is 99%, but you're trying to do it.
Right.
But that would count as an act of assault.
Right. I guess one more, hopefully like short one. I know you said 15 to 20 minutes. It would be, so say that, you know, we live in a non-stated society, but there are still some remaining states. Say North Korea still exists, and North Korea drops a bomb over these people's homes in California. Who do they retaliate against? And because they don't go and invade North Korea, you know, the people of North Korea didn't do it. Who do they retaliate against?
Yeah, that's a difficult question. I know what the objectivist answer is, that they say you could just nuke North Korea back, even if you kill civilians, because they blame the civilians for being so meek and weak to allow the North Korean government to get its power. I think that's probably a case where, look, libertarianism can only work where so-called peace is possible. I think that's a Lockean phrase. The whole point of libertarianism is for us to have civilization and society, and for us to live in peace and prosperity among each other and to cooperate. But obviously that's an ideal, and that's only possible where it's possible. Like the lifeboat scenario where the two guys, only one of them could live, no peace is possible. So there's no good solution.
Right.
In this case, I guess basically it's, you know, the citizens of Los Angeles facing a threat from North Korea. Either they're going to die, or they're going to eliminate the threat, and they're going to kill people in North Korea. I killer people. I don't know. I guess there's no good answer. There's no moral answer.
Right. I mean, I figured there isn't one. I just thought I'd run it by you. I think you've exhausted most of my questions. I hope to maybe email you back and forth about the whole intuitionism thing. I think I can formulate it better, given time to better respond over text and stuff like that. But other than that, I appreciate you coming on and everything. I'm sure that you guys here appreciate it as well.
Yeah, for sure. It's been informative.
Would you like us to send you? I can email you the link to the live stream.
Sure. Yeah, please do.
Okay.
All right. Well, thank you guys. I appreciate it. Good, nice questions.
Yeah.
All right.
Thanks for your time.
All right. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you guys. Bye-bye.
Bye now.
See you.
Alright, so I have to leave like right now, so I'll see you guys later.
All right. You drop.